Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity to participate on Coffee Chat. My name is Diaz Reyes. I currently teach in the interdisciplinary doctorate program here at Union Institute and University. I'm the chair of the Educational Studies concentration. My background is in anthropology, ethnic studies, education, and the law. I've been focusing on issues of education and youth culture, Black and Brown, Indigenous communities in Southern California. Today, I'd like to get an opportunity to share a little bit about the topic of Hispanic, Latino, and how to approach maybe a conversation. In particular, most of my work deals with communities that are working toward including, advancing, advocating for equity within the United States. And one of the ways I think we can kind of approach that is by thinking about the way we define ourselves, the way we think about ourselves and others. In particular, today, I'd like to really approach this conversation with a series of questions that I receive a lot. They're very kind of straightforward. The first one is usually, how do you define Hispanic? Then it goes into maybe, why are there so many different terms? And why does it matter which term I use, or why should it matter? What I think we can do today is briefly talk about the approach toward how we define or get toward a definition. And I'd like to think about it as starting a conversation. So today I feel very comfortable saying that the subject is very broad, very complex. And maybe today we just begin the conversation. And I said earlier, the way that I'd like to approach it is by thinking about, how do we define Hispanic? My approach has always been to think of it as a structural issue, in the sense that we think about outlining the way that institutions outline parameters for us to exist within, how economies outline the sense of self. So it's that relationship between the structural outlines and the individual lives that I present here. My approach toward how I define Hispanic is simply straightforward as a category of differentiation. The term is kind of loaded, but it just means a box, a label, an outline that is top down. History, politics, violence have outlined these boxes. And we're familiar with these classifications in the way we think about the labels of race, gender, class, nationality, sexuality, sexual orientation, ability, disability. We're familiar with the ways that we have learned to divide ourselves into types. So Hispanic is one of those types. And I'd like us to consider Hispanic as one of those categories, but get more accurate by thinking about this question. When I say Hispanic is a category of differentiation, I usually receive another question that says, yes, I get it, but are Hispanics a race or an ethnicity? What do we use to make sense of the concept of Hispanic? And I think that the question of, are Hispanics a race? I'd like to begin by thinking about the position of anthropology and saying that race biologically is not valid. I feel very comfortable saying that in the social sciences and in biology as well, that question has already been assessed. And the conclusion is that the human species is singular. There is no biological division among us that can be accurately expressed through race. But I only say that as a prefix, because ultimately we live in a racial worldview. The racial worldview has produced the racial construct, and race ideology has led to real material consequences. So to say that race is not biologically real does not mean that race does not have real effects. So is Hispanic a race? And I answer that with maybe it makes sense to think about how the US Census approaches Hispanic. And the US Census approaches Hispanic as not a race, but an ethnicity. So then the next question is, well, what is ethnicity? Ethnicity is not race because race assumes biology. Ethnicity stands on an assumption, a belief that culture is the parameter that outlines that definition. Ethnicity is a learned cultural expression. So we start thinking about, well, does that concept apply to Hispanic? If Hispanic is not a race, could it be an ethnicity? And I'm going to ask us to think more critically about ethnicity in this way. If ethnicity is a cultural community membership that is dependent on rich relationships of community, communication, caring, it's about a very loving and committed development of membership that requires deep understanding of one another. And I say that model kind of works, but not necessarily in how we use it most of the time. When people talk about ethnicity, they use the term of a country. And what they're actually referencing is not a small community in Southern California that has 100 people that are in one neighborhood that would be outlined as a viable membership. They reference a big country, and that takes us to this term ethnic nationalism. So I think a better term to understand Hispanic is the concept of pan-ethnicity. Pan-ethnicity works because it's more accurate. So let me just kind of reference that. Ethnicity seems to be a better model than race, but pan-ethnicity seems to be a better model than ethnicity by itself. The reason being that ethnicity doesn't work when there's such a large community. In the United States, we have this concept of Hispanic that my figures are not completely accurate here. They're just approximations, but I believe we're about 60 to 65 million people that are believed to be part of this Hispanic community. So you cannot know 60 to 65 million people. There cannot be one single community, one ethnic community composed of 60 to 65 million people. And given that that's such a broad, aggregated umbrella term, that's why pan-ethnicity works. Let me just give a little bit more definition of pan-ethnicity. Pan-ethnicity is a term of aggregation, an assumption, a top-down, institutionally outlined term that requires assumptions, stereotypes of similarity. And within that, there's an element of power and control in why this happens. But I want to emphasize that pan-ethnicity works because there's a level of coercion and consent to the aggregation, even when the people know that they are not identical. So that similarity is not a requirement, only the belief in similarity. And the belief can be top down. Those that have more power will be able to have a stronger voice. We're familiar with pan-ethnicity when we think about the Asian community or the Middle Eastern community. The Asian community may have people from China, Korea, Japan, maybe even communities from the Philippines, Vietnam, different languages, different practices, different religions, so different that it doesn't even make sense to put them all in one box. But within the United States, we use the term Asian. That's pan-ethnicity. The same approach, I think, is being used with the Hispanic and maybe Latino concept, that to think about Hispanic as this aggregated term that maybe has assumptions of Spanish origin. It works only if we believe that they're all the same. That similarity is actually countered immediately by many communities, thousands of communities, voicing expression that they are not all the same. But it doesn't matter, because pan-ethnicity here is about the term of use that applies institutionally. And within the United States, we see documents, we see programs that use Hispanic as the box, as the label, as the umbrella that will aggregate different terms. So it becomes easier to think that pan-ethnicity may be the closest term we can use to approximate definitions of what Hispanic is. But I'd like to return back to race for a minute, because even though I am saying that pan-ethnicity may be the term that works as a defining marker, if we listen, if we read to the way Hispanic is referenced in our communities, it's referenced in a racialized way. And what do I mean by a racialized way? If race is this assumption in the body, in the biological model of expression, it will be used in a certain way. For example, if we hear a description of a Hispanic male that's 5'8", weighs 160 pounds, that descriptor assumes something about the body. So I asked this question: what does a Hispanic male look like? And if you have an idea in your mind, you are racializing that body. So I returned to this conversation that within the Hispanic community, as a defining process, we are not going to be able to fully separate ourselves from the racial construct. And I think that's where I'd like to pause, that when we think about the Hispanic concept, the Latino concept, I am saying that pan-ethnicity seems to be a more accurate way of thinking about it, but ultimately we will not be able to distance ourselves, sever our sense of definitions from the concept of race. And it's ultimately because we live within a racialized society and the racial construct that has been outlined. So I think that is the way that I would kind of pause that moment of asking, is Hispanic a race? Is Hispanic a pan-ethnicity? By simply saying that it's complicated, and yet I think pan-ethnicity works better. However, we are always limited by the racial construct, so we return back to it. The next question that I think is fitting here is, why are there so many terms? I've been using the term Hispanic and hinting at Latino, but if most of us have been kind of keeping an ear and an eye out, we've been noticing that there's Hispanic, there's Latino, Latin American, and Latinx. So why are there so many terms? I think the terms are expressions of institutional outlines through different time periods. And some of them are the community themselves advocating for different terms. But the term Hispanic in particular is introduced in the 1970s institutionally. The US government adopts it as a government term that will be used consistently through paperwork and demographic accountability. And when it does that, it actually has to go out and teach people how to use that term. There are many documented media outlets that go out and start teaching people how to fill out the census, how to fill out paperwork with this new term. Hispanic, because the community itself is not the one that's advocating for Hispanic, but it's an institutionally outlined term that we see in the 70s and into the 80s. But something happens along the way and we start seeing a pushback. And by the 90s and 2000s, the term Latino is much more prevalent. And I think that the reason it is more prevalent is because of what I stated earlier, that Hispanic is an aggregated term, an umbrella term, a big net. So the communities are speaking back, pushing back by saying it does not speak correctly, it's not accurately, we do not feel it responds to us. So we advocate for different terms. And Latino became a much more popular term. But about 2010 and coming to 2020, we're seeing a lot more community spaces advocating for Latinx. And I think the term Latinx is referencing a much more gendered position to give voice to all the different ways that we can be within the gender constructs. The binary, in particular, the male, the female, the women, the men, these type of terms that we use may not be accurately expressed in this Latino with an O or Latina. So we start working with an X to create spaces that may be more inclusive of all the different gender ways that we can be. And I think what I'm excited though is about not necessarily advocating for a singular term of application, but by listening and giving respect to all the different ways that communities are advocating to be recognized in terminology. So when we think about why the different terms, it's because communities want to be heard, want to be visible. And I hope that we can start thinking about being respectful, encouraging, and accepting of all the different terms out there and find a place of comfort and respect within them. There's a space here, I think, that transitions to this question of like, why does it matter what term is used? And I think it's a good question because it tells us about the politics of naming. I think about the way that terms offer a direction of definition, how they create boundaries of membership that both include, but they also exclude. And as I was referencing this question of like, how do I define Hispanic, and is it a race, is it ethnicity? I think about that ultimately, we are going through this process of looking at this box, the Hispanic and Latino, as an aggregation, as an umbrella term. And then we recognize this response that these terms will not fit us all. They cannot, because as I stated earlier, we are not a single community. And all of the different ways that we can be as people cannot be held in the term Hispanic or Latino. So then I think when we start thinking about why does it matter, I think we think about the ways that this term opens up spaces to recognize those of us that feel silenced, invisibilized, marginalized in the Hispanic and Latino group, or in the Hispanic and Latino naming, the process of grouping, the process of classifying. And in particular, I'd like to give credit to, or emphasis to, two groups in particular, and that's the Indigenous and Black communities. There's an assumption that Hispanic and Latino is safe to credit as giving voice to a Spanish origin. And for many of us, the Spanish origin is not a comfortable place. So as Native people, as Black people, we may be honest and accurate and give some credit to the Spanish entry, the Spanish colonial experience, but there's not a beauty there. And we may not want to be defined through the Spanish colonial expression. And the indigenous and Black communities in particular become erased, I think, within the embracing of a generic Hispanic and Latino group. And I want to be respectful for those of us that feel comfortable using Hispanic and Latino and all the other variations. But I also want to give credit to, if respect is being offered toward Hispanic and Latino, then there should be a space of respect for indigenous and Black communities to speak about how Hispanic and Latino erases, marginalizes. So why does it matter what terms we use? I think it's because of the politics. And the politics of naming, to me, imply a resource in dispute, a resource of value, of caring. What is that resource? The way that I will exist in community, the way that I will advocate for resources, the way that I will advocate for safety and inclusion. So I think that the politics about naming is what I am more excited at this point, that I'm excited to see terms being introduced, be changed, because ultimately I think change is positive. Change is constant. It's the one thing that we can count on. We haven't used the same terms of 100 years ago, and we will not use the same terms 100 years into the future. I'd like to pause here. I think this was a good opportunity to think about this topic. I feel very fortunate to be invited, and I want to thank everyone for the opportunity. And I hope we can get another more opportunities to expand on this topic. And on that note, thank you. Muchas gracias. Tlazokamati.